Let's begin with a story. A few years ago, there was a creator whose life looked flawless. Her mornings began with meditation clips, her afternoons with sunlight and soft filters, and her captions spoke of gratitude and alignment. Her following exploded. She had become, as the world calls it, authentic. Yet one morning, she woke up and couldn't bear to post another word. She said later, "It wasn't burnout, it was betrayal. I'd built an image that even I couldn't live inside anymore." That sentence captures what Carl Jung warned of nearly a century ago. The greatest burden the soul must bear is the unlived life within it. We have entered an age where millions are paid, applauded, and algorithmically rewarded for living from only half of who they are. Every filter, every caption, every polished opinion slowly sculpts a persona, the mask we show to the world. Jung wrote that the persona is a kind of compromise between individual and society, like a system of behavior that enables one to adapt. It isn't false, it's simply partial. It's the negotiator between our raw self and what the collective approves of. But here's the problem Jung foresaw. When the mask becomes the only face we recognize, the parts we hide don't disappear, they darken. They fall into what Jung called the shadow. He said everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. In the digital age, we've mechanized that process. Algorithms now curate what gets seen, liked, and shared. The very process of persona construction has been industrialized. The result? Our feeds have become psychic mirrors that reward our light and banish our dark. But the psyche doesn't obey algorithms. What we repress returns, not as choice, but as compulsion. The more we identify with our curated selves, the more the disowned parts fight for entry. That's why so many creators who appear peaceful online confess to private anger, envy, or despair. Jung once told a patient, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In our time, you could say, "Until you confront the shadow, it will comment, post, and scroll in your place." What social media hides from us, what it can't afford to tell us, is that the very traits we hide are often the ones that contain our vitality. Jung observed that the shadow is 90% pure gold. In other words, it's not just the shameful that we repress, it's also our unlived potential, our courage, our sexuality, our truth-telling power. When we hide them, we don't become safer, we become fragmented. So this episode isn't about deleting your accounts or condemning technology. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that the feed has quietly trained you to exile. Over the next few sections, we'll explore how Jung's idea of the persona and the shadow plays out in our digital lives, and how, by seeing clearly, we can begin to live from wholeness again. Because as Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And perhaps the truest act of authenticity today is not to perform wholeness, but to become it. Carl Jung once said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." It's a necessary fiction, the social skin, that allows us to move among people without collapsing under the rawness of being known. We all begin wearing the persona early. A child learns that anger gets punished, tears make adults uncomfortable, humor gets approval, so we shape a face that fits the world. Jung compared it to a character in a play. You step on stage, you play your part. The danger, he warned, comes when you forget that you're acting. Social media makes this forgetting easy. The stage is infinite and the applause is real. The mask gains followers, the true self gains distance. You post a thought, it performs well, and now that thought becomes your brand. Slowly, the living person shrinks beneath the weight of the role. Jung called this identification with the persona, and he said it was a sign not of strength, but of psychic inflation, the ego believing it is the image it projects. And and yet, every time we build an identity out of approval, another part of us starts to protest. The denied feelings, the impulses we edit out, they don't vanish, they withdraw underground. That underground is the shadow. The shadow, Jung wrote, is the thing a person has no wish to be, but he also said it contains the roots of authenticity. The shadow isn't just evil or shame, it's everything that has been pushed out of you because it didn't fit the persona. The more good you become in public, the more your unconscious balances by generating an equal and opposite force in private. A saintly persona often conceals a proud, controlling, or resentful shadow. A strong persona hides insecurity. A serene one hides suppressed rage. The psyche seeks wholeness, and it will not be tricked by filters. Think about your online life. When you post something humble but secretly hope it's praised, that's the shadow tugging the mask. When someone's success provokes envy rather than inspiration, that's the shadow reminding you of unlived ambition. When you find yourself correcting others endlessly, the shadow is whispering about your own fear of being wrong. Jung urged his students not to destroy the persona, but to hold it lightly. We need the mask, he wrote, but we must not mistake it for the face. The aim is not to unmask entirely, but to remember that behind every persona stands a whole being, complex, contradictory, alive. So what happens when the mask becomes the identity and the shadow is left unspoken? That's where the digital era reveals its psychic danger. Because for the first time in history, our masks are not worn for an hour at a party, they're permanent, public, and algorithmically rewarded. Each like and share is a small injection of affirmation that the mask should stay. But the unconscious refuses exile. The repressed returns, sometimes as burnout, sometimes as moral outrage, sometimes as an anonymous comment written in a moment of projection. To meet our shadow, Jung said, we must confront the darkness in ourselves and give it recognition. To deny it is to live half a life. To integrate it is to become whole. And now that we've seen how the persona and the shadow are formed, the next step is to see what fuels them, not just psychology, but technology itself. Jung once said, the world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you. In our time, the world that tells us who we are is no longer a parent or a priest, it's an algorithm. An algorithm doesn't have morality, it has metrics. It rewards what performs, not what's true. The moment you click, comment, or hesitate, it learns what stirs you, not what fulfills you. And what stirs us most is rarely peace. It's polarity, certainty, and spectacle, the three traits that make the persona glitter while the shadow grows hungry beneath it. When Jung wrote about the persona, he warned that collective life always pressures us to conform to its expectations. But today's collective isn't a village, it's a digital consciousness. Millions of eyes without a face, rewarding us for extremes. Every like is a subtle nudge toward performance. Every viral post teaches the psyche. Exaggerate that. So the digital persona becomes hypertrophied, louder, shinier, more absolute, while the neglected parts of the self fall further into shadow. Notice what kind of traits thrive online. Dominance disguised as confidence, moral outrage disguised as righteousness, certainty masquerading as clarity. The algorithm amplifies them because they trigger engagement loops. And engagement is the new currency of existence. Jung might have called it a psychic inflation of the collective ego. We feed the system by feeding our persona, but the psyche does not tolerate one-sidedness for long. The more curated our online identity becomes, the more the shadow leaks through. You see it in envy scrolling through someone's success, in the quiet pleasure of seeing others fail, in the compulsive need to correct strangers. These are not moral failings, they're psychic compensations. Jung observed, every light casts a shadow, and the greater the light, the darker the shadow. The digital self burns brightly and thus casts a longer darkness. Think of it this way, algorithms amplify attention, attention amplifies persona, and persona, when inflated, summons its opposite from below. The result isn't evil, it's imbalance. The endless stream of stimulation becomes a mirror maze in which our unacknowledged emotions echo back, louder each time. We scroll to escape discomfort, and in doing so, feed it. Jung would call this a closed circuit of projection, where the outer world becomes the theater of our inner conflict. This is why the digital age feels simultaneously connected and hollow. The amplification doesn't stop with content, it extends into the psyche. The collective shadow begins to express itself through us. Tribalism, resentment, fanatic certainty. We become mouthpieces for the very unconscious forces we refuse to see. To step out of this loop, we must recognize the mechanism, not condemn it. The same amplification that distorts us can also awaken us if we notice what it reveals. The algorithm exposes what we crave to see, but also what we refuse to face. It's not just showing us the world, it's showing us ourselves. And that leads us to the next question. How can we tell when our shadow has begun to leak through our persona online? How do we spot it in real time before it hijacks our reactions? Carl Jung once wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Nowhere does that insight become more literal than on social media. We scroll, we watch, we react, and in those micro reactions, the shadow speaks. You don't need to dig through your dreams to meet it anymore. It's right there in your feed. It starts subtly. You feel a quiet tension as you scroll past someone's post. Not hatred, just a tightening behind the smile. You double tap something you don't actually like, just to keep the peace. You write a kind comment with a trace of competition beneath it. These are the fingerprints of the shadow, the psychic residue of disowned emotion trying to return to consciousness. Jung said, the shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. Online, the shadow finds its playground in comparison and projection. We see in others what we can't stand in ourselves or what we secretly wish we could be. The critic within us looks outward, cloaked in moral certainty. They're so fake. They only care about views. But each accusation, Jung would remind us, is a confession in disguise. What we attack out there mirrors what we repress in here. This is projection, one of Jung's most vital insights. He described it as an unconscious transfer of one's own qualities onto others. In the digital sphere, projection becomes ambient. The feed itself is built to keep it alive. It constantly offers faces to carry our unresolved feelings. The friend who always posts about success becomes the screen for our buried envy. The influencer preaching virtue becomes the target for our cynicism. The stranger with the opposite opinion becomes the vessel for our unspoken aggression. And the more we project, the less we know ourselves. Jung observed that the more projections are forced in between the subject and the environment, the more difficult it is for the ego to see through its illusions. We begin to mistake the outer storm for the inner one. You can recognize shadow activity by its emotional texture. Doom, scrolling, the compulsion to keep consuming even as you feel emptier. That's the psyche, trying to digest what it refuses to face directly. Reaction, regret, the moment you hit send or reply and feel a flash of shame. That's the shadow having spoken before you could translate it. Quiet contempt, that subtle pleasure in others' mistakes. It's the disowned failure within seeking attention. If you pay attention, the shadow always reveals itself through tone before thought. The tightening chest, the judgmental impulse, the sarcastic urge, all are signals. They are not signs of moral weakness, but invitations to integration. Jung would have called them the messengers of the unconscious, trying to restore balance between what we show and what we hide. But here's the paradox. The moment we see the shadow, it begins to lose its power. Conscious attention dissolves projection. Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. When you can say, yes, envy lives here, or yes, I hunger for validation. The energy that once fueled judgment turns into compassion for yourself, and by extension, for everyone else. So instead of asking, why are people online so fake? Ask, what part of me feels unseen? Instead of condemning the performative, look at what performance you still cling to. That's the turning point where awareness becomes transformation. And to deepen that transformation, we'll walk through a real case, an archetypal pattern that plays out every day on our screens. A persona that looks holy, but hides a hungry shadow underneath. Let's look at a living archetype, one that thrives online, praised by millions, yet secretly haunted by its own reflection. I call it the saint. The saint persona is immaculate. It shares wisdom, radiates calm, speaks of compassion and light. Its captions read like scripture: be kind, let go, rise above. The saint is everything the collective admires. And that's precisely the danger. Because the more perfect the light, the more invisible the shadow behind it. Carl Jung warned, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The saint in Jungian terms is the ego's adaptation to the demand for moral and emotional purity. But beneath that purity often lies a deep, unconscious pride, a subtle conviction of superiority that says, I am the one who sees. And sooner or later, the shadow demands balance. Imagine a creator, let's call her Amara. Her posts are small sermons on empathy. Her followers call her a healer. Every week she speaks about forgiveness, and privately she keeps a growing list of people she's blocked. She starts to resent those who criticize her tone, telling herself they just don't get it. Yet late at night she scrolls through their profiles, feeling something she can't name: envy, irritation, maybe even fear. That feeling is her shadow trying to speak. The saint persona has exiled her anger, her competitiveness, her need to be seen as just another flawed human. And because she won't allow those traits in consciousness, they return as judgment toward others who display them openly. This is how projection masquerades as morality. Jung said, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. When Amara accuses others of ego, what she's really seeing is the ego she's not allowed to own. When she scolds others for negativity, it's her own repressed aggression asking to be acknowledged. The more she performs calmness, the more volatile she feels. The more she preaches detachment, the more attached she becomes to being seen as wise. And eventually, she burns out not from doing too much, but from being too little of herself. Jung often emphasized that the shadow is morally neutral. It isn't evil, it's energy. He wrote, the shadow is a living part of the personality and therefore wants to live with it in some form. In Amara's case, that means her judgment, her assertiveness, even her anger aren't poisons to be purged, they're vitality to be integrated. If she could admit, yes, I want to be admired, yes, I feel envy, yes, I want to win, those confessions would not diminish her spirituality, they would humanize it. Her humility would stop being performance and become reality. Now turn that mirror toward yourself. Ask, where am I always right online? What role do I play so perfectly that I can't afford to be seen breaking character? Maybe you're the rational one, always debunking others' beliefs. Maybe you're the empath, always soothing, never showing irritation. Maybe you're the rebel, allergic to authority, yet secretly craving validation from it. Each persona has its inverse. Jung wrote, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. To integrate the shadow, you must first descend not into sin, but into sincerity. The descent begins with honesty. It's the moment you stop defending your light and start befriending your darkness. Only then can the energy trapped in repression return to serve creation rather than consume it." And this brings us to the work itself, not the theory, but the practice. Jung believed that transformation begins when we enter dialogue with what we fear inside. He called this active imagination a way of making the unconscious speak. In the next section, we'll use that principle to build a practical tool, a three-step integration protocol for bringing the shadow into conscious partnership. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become whole by suppressing what is dark, but by integrating it." Integration isn't about becoming perfect, it's about ceasing to war with yourself. The shadow is not your enemy, it's your exiled ally. The practice we're about to explore, the three R's, recognize, relate, re-express, is a modern adaptation of Jung's method for meeting the unconscious and turning its raw emotion into conscious energy. 1. Recognize, name the shadow when it knocks. The shadow rarely enters through the front door. It slips in through irritation, jealousy, or that subtle urge to prove something. The first step is to recognize its arrival. Jung taught that the shadow becomes hostile only when ignored. So recognition is not confession, it's observation without shame. Start with the trigger, something small. A post that annoys you, a friend's success that unsettles you, a public figure who stirs your judgment. Pause and write down 3 traits you perceive in that person. For example, arrogant, self-promoting, shallow. Now ask yourself, where might those traits live in me? Maybe you fear being seen as arrogant, so you hide your confidence. Maybe you wish you could self-promote without shame. The act of naming these traits reclaims psychic projection and returns energy to you. Jung once told a student, "What we deny in ourselves, we meet in the outer world as fate. Recognition dissolves that fate. When you see the pattern, you're no longer enslaved by it." 2. Relate, enter dialogue with the disowned self. Recognition opens the door. Relation invites the shadow inside. Jung developed a practice called active imagination, a way of conversing with unconscious figures to bring their wisdom into consciousness. He said to confront a person with his shadow is to show him his own light. Try this. Write a dialogue with the part of you that reacted. If the emotion had a voice, what would it say? Let it speak freely. Don't moralize. Don't edit. You might discover that your anger isn't cruelty, but a plea to be respected. Your envy might confess, "I just want to be seen." The point isn't to silence the shadow, but to humanize it. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious is autonomous, it wants to be heard, not controlled. When you dialogue with it, you transform an enemy into an informant. The energy once spent repressing becomes available for creativity, intimacy, and clarity. 3. Re-express. Give the shadow a clean channel. Energy denied turns toxic. Energy expressed becomes medicine. After recognition and relation, the third step is re-expression, acting in the world with new integrity. Jung noted that every transformation demands as its precondition the ending of one psychological situation and the birth of another. You don't need grand gestures. Try small, deliberate experiments. Set a boundary you've avoided because you fear disapproval. Share something honest online, not confessional, but real, something that risks imperfection. Speak a truth you've been editing for too long. Each act of re-expression integrates a fragment of the shadow into conscious life. You start to feel less split between who you should be and who you are. The goal isn't to defeat the shadow, but to let its power flow through you without possession. Jung said, "The shadow is not a moral problem, it is a challenge to self-knowledge." Re-expression is that knowledge embodied. And here's the paradox. The more you integrate your shadow, the less reactive the world becomes. Your feet, your peers, even your critics begin to lose their psychic charge. You stop needing to prove, defend, or correct. The shadow, once feared, becomes an inner compass pointing not to your flaws, but to your unfinished humanity. Jung believed that every persona, every mask we wear, has a counterforce waiting in the unconscious to keep it in balance. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote, and there is no light without shadow, no wholeness without opposites. The psyche, like nature, always seeks equilibrium. In the digital age, that balance is often lost. We inhabit exaggerated archetypes. The sage dispensing wisdom, the hero chasing visibility, the caregiver soothing endlessly, the rebel tearing down. Each one has value. But the moment we cling to it as an identity, the psyche compensates by summoning its opposite. The sage, for instance, secretly needs the fool, the one who can laugh, stumble, and say, "I don't know." Without the fool, wisdom hardens into performance. Jung would say the fool carries the medicine for the sage's inflation. The hero needs the lover to remind him that life is not just conquest but connection. The caregiver needs the warrior, the courage to say no. And the rebel needs the builder to channel destruction into creation. These archetypes aren't roles to switch between, they're currents within us, always seeking harmony. When one dominates, the other withers and the shadow grows. Jung described individuation as the process by which a person becomes the one he or she is meant to be. That becoming requires holding contradictions without collapsing into either side. So if your persona online is thoughtful and calm, let yourself be messy in private. If you're known for your strength, allow moments of tenderness. If you've built a brand on rebellion, practice commitment. This isn't hypocrisy, it's psychological nutrition. You're feeding the opposite pole that keeps the self alive. Because, as Jung said, the greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a tension of opposites. Integration isn't stillness. It's the dynamic harmony between your visible and invisible selves. Remember, we're not deleting the mask, we're widening the self that wears it. In the next part, we'll bring this inner balance into a practical rhythm, a way to engage with social life and posting itself as a spiritual practice, not a performance. Jung wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human psyche." If that's true, then every post, every share, every small act of expression online participates in the shaping of the collective psyche. And if our collective mind is sick with projection, comparison, and noise, the cure begins with how each of us approaches that tiny moment before we click post. The sustainable posting ritual is a way to make digital life part of individuation, a conscious act instead of a reflex. It's not a rule book. It's a rhythm that anchors you in awareness before, during, and after expression. 1. The pre-post check. Before you post, pause. Close your eyes for 10 seconds and notice your body. Where is the tension? What emotion sits beneath this impulse to share love, excitement, validation, anger, fear? Jung once said, emotion is the chief source of consciousness. There is no change from darkness to light or from inertia to movement without emotion. If your motive is charged, it's not wrong, it's revealing. Acknowledge it. The pause transforms compulsion into choice. You may still post, but now you're the author, not the algorithm. You can add a single question to this check. What part of me is speaking right now, the persona or the self? If it's the persona, You might feel the need to prove, polish, or please. If it's the self, the tone will feel grounded, simple, at peace, even if unpolished. 2. The intent statement. Next, clarify why you're sharing. Not to justify, to anchor. It can be a silent sentence. May this post express something true. May this serve connection, not comparison. May I share, not perform. This is the psychological equivalent of setting a compass. Jung wrote, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. That light begins with intent. When you state it, you lift the act of posting out of automation and into consciousness. The post becomes not a performance, but a practice. 3. The compassionate comment policy. Once the post lives in the world, your persona and shadow will both want to manage it. One will crave approval, the other will react to criticism. So create a personal ritual of compassion. When reading comments, remember Jung's principle of projection. Everyone sees through their own shadow first. This applies both ways. Praise and blame are mirrors, not verdicts. Respond when you have presence, not when you have impulse. If something wounds you, breathe before replying. You are not the comment, you are the consciousness reading it. 4. The post-mortem without shame. Afterward, reflect not on performance metrics, but on psychic residue. Ask yourself, did that post feel aligned with myself or my persona? Did it cost me energy or restore it? If it drained you, that's feedback from the unconscious. Some part of you felt unseen. If it nourished you, integration has occurred. The act expressed truth rather than image. Jung taught fullness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. When you bring that spirit even to your smallest online acts, you transform social media from a hall of mirrors into a field of awareness. The goal isn't perfection, it's sustainability. To stay human amid machinery, to speak with the soul in a world of signals. And as you practice this, something subtle changes. The feed stops feeling like a battlefield of egos and starts to resemble what Jung might have called the collective dream, one in which your presence adds consciousness rather than confusion. Which brings us to the closing invitation, how to make all this real in daily life, not as theory, but as living practice. Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that is the heart of this entire journey. The shadow you hide is not your flaw, it's your future waiting to be met. We've traced the path from the persona's polished surface, through the shadow's hidden depths, into the rhythm of integration and conscious expression. But knowledge without practice remains theory. So, I leave you with a simple challenge, not to fix yourself, but to meet yourself. For the next 7 days, keep what I call a shadow journal. Each day, write down one reaction that stirred you online, something that made you angry, envious, or self-conscious. Then ask, what part of me is this showing me? Write the answer without judgment. If you stay with the question long enough, the face you thought you despised will turn and show you your own reflection. And at least once during those 7 days, make one honest share. Not a confession, not a spectacle, just something true. Something slightly uncomfortable because it's real. It could be an unedited thought, a quiet doubt, a forgotten joy. What matters isn't how it's received, it's that it comes from your wholeness, not your mask. You'll notice something. The more authentic your relationship to your shadow, the calmer your presence becomes. You react less, you listen more. You stop performing truth and start living it. Jung said the shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared, who goes down to the deep well. But he also said that beyond that door lies renewal, the rediscovery of the self. And as we close, remember, Your online life is not separate from your inner life. Every scroll, every post, every pause is an invitation to know yourself more deeply. Because the feed, like the dream, is a mirror of the psyche. And in the next episode, we'll explore exactly that, how your dreams reveal what your shadow still wants you to know. Until then, keep the journal, make the honest share, and walk gently with your own darkness. It's not against you, it's waiting to make you whole.